We're all set. Good afternoon to all of you, and I'm very pleased to start this series with Unacademy. The first of five lectures this week, starting with today on the United Nations, India, and the world. We've got a rather vast theme to cover in this first lecture, so I may be a little more brisk than would be ideal in terms of actually getting getting all of you on board, but I'm trying to get my slides to behave, and I can see that I'm already having a challenge doing that. Let me see. All right, well, I'm clearly not a gifted slide person because I'm not getting any slides coming up. Let me see if you can listen to me and get this just by watching me rather than by watching slides that I'm unable to get going here. 1 second. There we are. All right, well, sorry about that. So I guess you'll just have to listen to me. And let me start with the United Nations. Many people don't realize that the United Nations was actually an organization that existed before it existed. In other words, during World War II, the countries that won World War II, when they fought together, the media called them the Allies, but they called themselves the United Nations. And so in 1945, the victorious allies of the Second World War converted this organization into a peacetime organization. This group that had won the war became a peacetime organization. And as a result, what we've got now is a body that turned from a wartime organization into a peacetime organization, but motivated throughout by the desire to ensure that what happened during the first half of the world of the 20th century, when you had two world wars, countless examples of civil wars, mass displacement of populations, human rights atrocities, the Holocaust and Hiroshima, all of those horrors of the first half of the 20th century should not be allowed to happen again. And with the slogan of never again, they created a world body, the United Nations, whose job it was to ensure that as far as the whole world was concerned, they would find ways of cooperating rather than going to war with each other. The objectives of the United Nations were laid out in a historic charter adopted by countries in 1945 to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. Apart from this, the UN had a number of goals beyond the issue of war. There was respect for human rights. There was a respect for the sovereign equality of nations, big or small. They wanted to create better standards of living in a larger freedom for all of humanity, which included freedom from hunger, freedom from poverty, freedom from bad climate, as well as, of course, freedom to enjoy social progress. And this was what the United Nations was all about. The three pillars of the UN system of organizations that got set up in the succeeding years were, first and foremost, the maintenance of world peace and security to prevent another world war. The second was the promotion of human rights, and the third was the protection of human rights, and the third was the promotion of development, all of which were within the context of these larger freedoms, as I've explained. Now, if you look at the actual record of the UN against each of these objectives, you can be forgiven for seeing that there were some positives and some negatives. Let's take peace, for example. The UN originally intended itself to, as I say, convert the victorious allies into a peacetime organization. So they assumed that the countries that had won the Second World War would stay united. The UN Charter speaks of a military staff council of the 5 big members, the permanent members of the UN. And these 5 countries were going to have their military commanders connect with each other and actually run the world organization together and make sure that if any conflict came up, the US, the Soviet Union, Britain, France, and China would together go in and stop it. Well, as we all know, that couldn't happen because there was a Cold War in which the Soviet Union on the one hand and the US on the other became deeply divided rivals marked by great animosity, ideological difference. And they spent the years after the Second World War in a busy contest for about 4 decades and a half to undermine each other and bring each other down. In this situation, the military staff committee and all of these arrangements was not going to be able to work. So what could the UN do? All the UN could do was to think on its feet and come up with a different way of keeping peace. And our second Secretary General of the UN, Dag Hammarskjöld, a very bright and original Swede, found a way. He invented something which was not even mentioned in the UN Charter, the concept of peacekeeping, which he said was a way in which he would address the challenges of conflict without using the military force of the big powers, since they could not agree and they mistrusted each other. So if any of the big powers went in, the other big power would be unable to actually trust them. So instead, the peacekeeping technique used the middle and smaller powers of the organization. India, Canada, Nepal, Fiji, Ireland, Norway. These were the small and medium countries that were enlisted to send troops into conflicts where they had no direct interest. They were not acting on behalf of any superpower. They were there only on behalf of the world body. And in this process, peacekeeping was born. And it worked very well in very specific kinds of circumstances where a conflict had come to a wary end. Neither side could trust each other. They needed a strong and at the same time a trustworthy, neutral or impartial country or group of countries to keep the peace between them. And that's what the UN could do. So in fact, they turned out to be doing a huge favor for the big superpowers, who are usually supporting one or the other antagonist in a conflict. But when the UN went in, the superpowers could back off, knowing that the UN would act objectively and ensure that whatever peace had been agreed would be maintained. And as a result, the UN actually won 3 Nobel Prizes for peace, prizes that were given specifically to the UN's Blue Helmets for their work in keeping peace in a number of conflict situations. The Nobel Peace Prize was given to a UN mediator, Dr. Ralph Bunche, way back in 1950. And at the same time, the UN won the Nobel Peace Prize for itself and for its head, Kofi Annan, in 2001. So you had an organization that had won universal acclaim. And you could say, well, isn't that great? It was able, for example, to prevent wars breaking out in situations which had only recently settled into a truce. It was able, for example, to go beyond that and bring West Irian or Irian Jaya, a former Dutch colony, into the Indonesian fold. It was able to supervise the free departure or secession, if you want to call it that, of East Timor, Timor-Leste, from Indonesia. It was able to end a long and protracted civil war in Mozambique. It was able to bring Namibia to independence. But it also had setbacks. The UN could not resolve crises, it could merely keep the peace. So the Vietnam War raged throughout the 60s, but the UN could do nothing about it. India and Pakistan fought 4 wars that the UN could do nothing about. The Israeli-Palestinian issue was never resolved. Yes, the UN kept the peace temporarily, particularly after the Suez Crisis in 1956, but when the UN was asked to leave in 67, war broke out again. Then the UN came in again after the 67 war, but once again, that truce ended in 73 and a new war broke out. So no lasting solutions could be guaranteed in some of the most intractable conflicts around the world. And then, frankly, if you look at the way in which our own situation in India is concerned, we found ourselves very often seeing the UN using peacekeeping in ways of which we did not totally approve. I was myself involved in a situation, the civil war in the former Yugoslavia, where we had a huge challenge, where peacekeepers were sent in where there was no peace to keep. I was in charge of leading the team at UN headquarters in New York while that was going on. I'll talk about that when we come to my own experience in the UN. But peacekeeping ideas don't work where there is no peace to keep. And the result was precisely that we had a protracted conflict that only ended with a decisive intervention by the United States and the Western countries on one side of the conflict, which went right against all the principles of the UN. Then we had, in the human rights arena, great success in setting the norms, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the adoption of 2 major international conventions, one on social and political rights, the other on, I beg your pardon, political and cultural rights, and the other on social and economic rights. Then you have the creation of the UN Human Rights Council, the International Criminal Court, which followed the setting up of war crimes tribunals that actually tried people for what they were doing, sometimes to their own citizens. All of these things suggest that human rights has really arrived on the world agenda. People understand the concept, they respect it, they at least pay lip service to it. But you could argue that in effect, it's been relatively ineffective in actually ensuring the defense of human rights, because after all, these bodies can only get their view, get their way when countries agree to their jurisdiction. And in many issues, they have found themselves helpless to resolve major human rights violations, whether the killings in Syria by all sides had led to Europe's largest refugee crisis since the Second World War, or closer to home for us, the Rohingya crisis in Myanmar, in which an entire ethnic group felt persecuted and moved on. Now, one of the issues that always comes up with the United Nations is to look at these records of failures. Oh, I didn't talk about development. In development, again, the UN did a better job in agenda setting. Agenda setting in the sense that the entire world accepted that the development of the poorer countries was a very major objective of the United Nations. But very often it became an exercise in lip service. Very few countries were able to fulfill the agreed UN target of contributing 0.7% of their GDP, their gross domestic product, to developing countries. And because they couldn't do that, we found ourselves in a position where development became an idea that was honored in the breach. Now, let's turn to the question of how we reform this organization, because indeed, if we have this kind of mixed record, how can we move ahead and look at the reform of the United Nations Security Council? Well, the fact of the matter is that if you were to look at the way in which the entire debate has been framed, it has been framed very, very much as one of the Security Council. And indeed, the Security Council is deeply flawed. It reflects in many ways the geopolitical realities of 1945 rather than of today. And as a result, everyone says, when will India get a place on the Security Council? How can we change this? And you can argue that there is a very good reason to rethink the UN. There is a mathematical reason. First of all, when the UN was founded, it just had, in 1945, 54 member states, and the Security Council was 11 countries, which meant literally that almost 20% of the membership was on the Security Council. But the UN expanded with India's efforts to successfully decolonize various countries that had been taken over by the powers earlier. And when they were decolonized and they became free, they became members of the United Nations. As the membership grew, the one and only successful amendment to the UN Charter occurred in the early 1960s, when the membership of the Security Council went up from 11 to 15. But as a percentage of the UN, 15 is less than 8% of the current membership of the United Nations, which is 193 countries. So mathematically, one could argue that the Security Council is no longer a terribly representative body. Second, there is a question of geographical representation. Not only is the Security Council composition skewed heavily in favor of the developed North, but particularly the Europeans do rather well out of this. If you realize that Russia is also European power, then 4 out of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council are white people of European descent. And this raises a real question. What about the rest of the world? When will they equally be represented in the Security Council? And then there is a political argument for reform, which is you guys won a world war 75 years ago. How long are you going to rest on that to insist that that entitles you to come up with a say, including a veto on what the rest of us want to do 75 years later? What gives you, 75 years on, an argument to continue in this special status? Well, there is a lot of procedural inertia behind this. I was at the United Nations when Secretary General Boutros Ghali announced in 1992 that he wanted to see the UN Security Council reformed in time for the 50th anniversary of the organization in 1995. And that seemed an applaudable and at the same time realistic objective at that time. But as you know, it didn't happen. The 50th anniversary went by, the 60th anniversary has gone by, the 70th anniversary is over. And this year, 2020, we're heading for the 75th anniversary of the United Nations. But Security Council reform is not even on the horizon. Why is that? Because the only way you can reform the Council is by amending the UN Charter. And any amendment requires a 2/3 majority of the overall membership. In other words, 129 of the 193 states in the General Assembly. And what is more, an amendment would further have to be ratified by 2/3 of the member states. And that means not just the member states, and normally it's parliaments in most countries that ratify. So the government alone can't be in favor. The parliament has to agree. And that has to include all 5 permanent members. So you need a formula that simultaneously appeals to 2/3 of the members and at the same time doesn't arouse the objection of the 2/3 of the countries whose powers you want to dilute. So you can imagine it's a very tough prescription to come up with that will satisfy both people. And the parliamentary aspect means that in the US, for example, one single powerful US senator could hold up a vote on a ratification by the US, and without all 5 permanent members ratifying, no vote will be accepted. So then, if it's so difficult to reform, what's the point talking about it? Well, the best argument for reform is that the absence of reform could discredit the United Nations itself. In the absence of reform, the Security Council risks being seen as a more and more unrepresentative body. And when a body is unrepresentative, but it is taking major decisions of war and peace, taking major decisions involving the well-being of everyone, sanctions, for example, against member states, then its legitimacy comes into question. And if the legitimacy of the UN is eroded, countries will increasingly turn to and rely on alternative partnerships like the G8 and the G20. This is why it's extremely important that we see UN reform, and the same applies to other institutions in the United Nations system, not just the permanent membership of the Security Council itself. I believe that we're having a bit of an issue. One second. I'm going to try once again to see if I can get these slides to work, because at the moment, as you can see, they're not. Yes, there we are. All right, finally it didn't work earlier, but there you are. You've got them all right now. This is what we already covered. I'll give you a minute to quickly look at it, because we've already talked about this one. We've talked about the 3 major pillars. We've talked about how the UN's record was mixed in all of these 3 pillars of the United Nations. Do take a look at them. We talked about development, but we didn't fully talk about development. I was going on about the Security Council, so I'll come back to the slide in a minute. This is the Security Council slide that we were just talking about. The veto powers, the permanent members, the Cold War divisions amongst the superpowers, and of course, as a result of all of this, the Security Council tends to become a law unto itself, and the General Assembly, which is where all the members are, they're not quite on the same page. Now, just go back briefly to that development slide. The UN's success has been, as I mentioned, principally in agenda setting, in setting objectives and targets for rich countries to fulfill. UNICEF has been successful. International Labour Organization has done a great job of promoting labour standards around the world. And until recently, at any rate, the WHO was seen as a very important bulwark against global disease. But as I also mentioned, and it's not on the slide, the fact is that the record was a bit mixed because the development arms of the UN could never persuade the rich countries to actually come up with the kinds of resources that they ideally need. 0.7% of GDP was a target that was announced, with the exception of, I think, just Norway. Practically no country gives that much money. When the UN adopted the Millennium Development Goals back in 2000, and 15 years later adopted the Sustainable Development Goals, they had Goal 8 of the MDGs and Goal 17 of the SDGs, both of which call for the rich countries to give more to the poor to promote development. But in fact, what happened was that those goals have remained goals that exist in rhetoric but have not been fulfilled in practice. Okay, now we can continue talking along with the slides. We've already talked about the Security Council reforms, but we haven't talked about what India's position is. But India certainly feels that, that the Security Council is a place at the global high table, and India deserves to be on it. So India's stand is that the seat of the UN Security Council is not at sale to be given to the highest bidder. You must look at what a country can contribute to the UN, not just their monetary strength. The US is still the largest donor to the UN, and the China is becoming larger because every 3 years its share gets increased because its economy is increasing. But Japan and Germany are still the second and third largest contributors to the UN, and they're not permanent members, so money alone doesn't work. India talks about the role of a country in strengthening the United Nations. India talks about its contributions to world peace, the fact that India is still today the largest single contributor of troops over the 54 operations over the 75 years of the United Nations. That it is a country that so far has been able to manage diversity at home very well. Sadly, in recent months, our record is not quite where it should be, but that's a different topic. And then, of course, our commitment to international law and peace has been very strong. Even in that famous Tryst with Destiny speech at the moment of our independence, our first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, spoke of his dreams for India, but he said his dreams are not only for India, they're for the whole world, because the nations of the world are indivisible, and peace and war are also indivisible. They affect us all. And that spirit has been very present in India's approach. I've been asked by Unacademy to talk a little bit about my own experience at the UN. I'm going to keep it relatively brief because we only have another 20 minutes and there's a lot of ground still to be covered in this vast topic. But I began at a time when the main UN wasn't taking any Indians. Indians were deemed overrepresented. That's been true for most of my adult life, and Indians are still overrepresented again today, though they went through a brief period when a lot of Indians retiring, including myself, must have opened up a few vacancies for Indians. Indians are again overrepresented. But the UN has what are called funds and programs, as well as agencies where the geographical quota doesn't apply. And UN High Commissioner for Refugees, UNHCR, was one of them. And I joined them where nationality was not an issue, but there were practically no Indians in the organization. There was just one before me. It was a very small organization looking after refugees. But soon after I joined, the refugee crises around the world exploded. The Vietnamese boat people started fleeing communism in tiny boats and heading out to countries in Southeast Asia. We had civil war in Nicaragua. We had civil conflicts in Ethiopia, Eritrea. We had the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and refugees coming out there. So there were refugees flooding around the world, and UNHCR grew from a tiny, almost anonymous organization to one that was being mentioned in the first 4 out of every 5 news bulletins in the BBC World Service. I spent 11 years there, and I must say it was an extraordinary experience. In my first stint, I was at headquarters. I learned about international humanitarian law, which sometimes made me think of Napoleon's crack about the Holy Roman Empire, that it was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire, because public international law seems really neither public nor international nor law, not in the sense of a law that you can enforce. You can only persuade governments, sovereign member states of the UN, to do the right thing by refugees. But the basic principles of giving asylum to refugees on the basis of objective fears, for example, a refugee is defined internationally as one who fears persecution on grounds of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group such as gender or political opinion. So if you're outside your home country and you're unable or unwilling to return to your home country because of this well-founded fear of persecution, then you're a refugee, and the world has an obligation not to send you back to your country against your will, and an obligation to give you asylum and protection. And UNHCR would then either not just protect them first, but would either keep them in the countries where they sought asylum until they could voluntarily repatriate to their home countries when the country conditions that had sparked their departure were different, had changed, or they could integrate them locally in the neighboring country. That would happen a lot in Africa, where very often refugees had kin across a new international border, and they would be locally integrated there with some assistance from the international community. And then the third, and in many ways the least desirable, because it was the most expensive solution, was resettlement in a third country often far away. So the Vietnamese boat people, the neighboring countries were not prepared to integrate them in Southeast Asia, so they all had to be accommodated in lives in many, many countries around the world, in the US and Canada and France and so on, half a world away from not only the country they had fled, Vietnam, but also from the countries that they had found initial asylum in. And this became a very significant refugee movement. I was in charge of the Singapore office of UNHCR from 81 to the end of 84, 3.5 years during which I had a huge crisis to solve, thousands of refugees in a tiny refugee camp that was unable to accommodate them because the office had been unable to resettle them. The Singapore government taking an increasingly tough stand that they wouldn't allow any more disembarkations unless the UN could get these people off their soil. And I was given that responsibility. It was an amazing experience for a young man. I was all of 25 when I started that. I got a PhD at 22 in the US, and then joined the UN right off the bat. So I was learning on the job. But what was particularly striking about that was the human dimension of the work. I had to negotiate the disembarkation of the refugees with the Singapore government. I had to persuade countries of resettlement to take them, even when it meant stretching some of their immigration rules and policies, in order to be able to encourage the Singaporeans to continue allowing more refugees to disembark. And on top of that, I had to ensure that as far as the process was concerned, it was conducted smoothly and efficiently, so the Singapore government had no reason to object to the UN's continued role. One of the things I had to do, for example, was to create a capacity to actually run the refugee camp myself, which the UN officially didn't want me to do, because officially the UNHCR in those days considered itself non-operational. But at the same time, the Singapore government, unlike all the other Asian countries, did not want to take responsibility for the refugee camp themselves. They wanted the UN to have the headache. So there were a lot of these challenges that I had to find creative solutions to. And elsewhere, where we have more time, I can talk about many stories about it. But I'll just give you one story from the boat people crisis that really marked me for a long time, which was a young family that left Vietnam in a tiny boat with a cannibalized tractor engine to power it. Sure enough, the engine conked out on the high seas. They were drifting aimlessly in the South China Sea, really surviving on just rainwater and hope. But they had 2 small children with them. And in fact, the two small children, one was a baby, the other was an infant. They couldn't live on rainwater. They'd already run out of food and baby food and drinking water and everything else they had on the boat. So the parents did something astonishing. They took out a penknife and slit their own fingers and made the babies suck their blood in order to get some nutrients in order to stay alive. Fortunately, they did stay alive. As it happens, they were rescued by an American ship. And when that ship came into port, my staff and I bust every rule in the book to rush this family, critically weak, unable to sit or stand, to the intensive care unit. And then to see that same family a few months later, healthy, well-fed, well-dressed, and heading off to new lives in their country of resettlement, the US, offered the kind of satisfaction that few other more bureaucratic jobs or UN jobs in the conventional sense would have permitted. I felt I could put my head to the pillow at night, knowing that things I had done during the day had made a real difference to real people's lives. And there are people growing up American or French or Canadian because of my success in intervening on their behalf and getting certain immigration norms relaxed to take them. All of this made for a very interesting time. I continued at headquarters thereafter for a few more years. And I have to say that what kept me going was the belief that yesterday's refugee problems did not remain refugee problems today for the most part. And that if we kept doing our job well and with conviction, that today's refugees need not remain refugees tomorrow. I then shifted to peacekeeping at United Nations headquarters in New York. It happened to be the end of the Cold War, and the result was once again a dramatic explosion in that activity. I've often joked to people that, you know, if your company is in need of business, hire me, because I came into UNHCR when practically no one had heard of it. It was a tiny organization. All of us knew each other by their first names. And within a year, the caseload of refugees had gone up 100-fold. The budget of the organization had quintupled and the staff had quadrupled. So then I moved to peacekeeping. At that point, there were just 5 of us at UN headquarters doing peacekeeping. I was brought in as the 5th person because of the independence of Namibia, which was going to happen over a few months, and they thought one extra person would help. And the irony was that within a year of my doing that, the Cold War ended, various conflicts erupted around the world, for which peacekeeping was deemed to be the only solution. And we went from being a rather tiny part of the UN in terms of headquarters staff. We did have about 10,000 troops in the field, but in 5 largely stable operations, into at peak a body with over 800 people at headquarters, 88,000 troops in the field, many of them serving in the operation I was responsible for, Yugoslavia, and with a colossal presence in 18 different regions and conflict situations around the world. Again, Yugoslavia, very different situation from peacekeeping because I wasn't solving problems every day. On the contrary, I was working 18-hour days, very often not getting to see my kids until breakfast the next morning once I had dropped them off at school in the morning, because I was very rarely home till midnight. And yet, one had the different kind of satisfaction of leaving one's smudgy thumbprints on the footnotes of the pages of history. Just as the Vietnamese Boat People crisis was one of the great events of our time, so too was the Yugoslav Civil War and the entire transformation of peacekeeping at that time. Since I mentioned it briefly and we're running out of time, I'll move on. I then, the man I was working with as the second Under-Secretary General for Peacekeeping I worked with, Kofi Annan. Kofi Annan was elected Secretary General at the end of 1996. And from the 1st of January 97, I worked with him as his executive assistant in the Secretary General's office, traveling around the world with him, meeting world leaders alongside him, an extraordinary opportunity to see how the world works, as it were. To have a cup of tea with the British Prime Minister in 10 Downing Street in a sitting room so small, your knees were practically rubbing up against his, to have vodka with the President of Russia in the Kremlin, to go and stay in the special compound reserved for the Chinese Communist leadership in Beijing. All of these experiences occurred in those few years working directly alongside Kofi Annan, even being the person who accompanied Kofi Annan when he had an audience with the Pope, Pope John Paul the second a year or two before he passed away, about a year before he passed away. So I had these extraordinarily eye-opening experiences, and one of the things I learned from them is that world leaders, once you overcome the awe you feel at talking to people you've actually seen only on television screens or in newspapers, they're just like you and me. They are regular people, and they have their fears, their flaws, their weaknesses, as well as their strengths, their qualities, their charisma, of course, whatever got them to that position. But they're human beings trying to do their best with all their vanities, all their strengths, and all their limitations. And the result very often with them is that in many ways, the world is not as well run as it should be, and sometimes things get done despite them. That experience may well have been added to by my experience for 6 years as Under Secretary General of the United Nations. I was given the leadership of the largest department of the UN, the Department of Public Information, which had 880 staff around the world in 77 countries. I was put in there at a time when a lot of pressure from the rich countries, particularly the US, to cut back on budgets, reduce staff, close offices, and at the same time, the morale in the Department of Public Information was rather low, and I had to revive their morale as well. And in that process, I must say I had the great opportunity and challenge to actually do my very best, both to boost them, to give them a sense of purpose. So they weren't just coming in to write a press release or design a poster or run an exhibition. They were coming in because their work was going to help the UN get its message across more effectively to improve the lives of the millions of people around the world. And in addition to that, I also managed to streamline the structure of the organization, close a few offices, regionalize some of my offices, save the budget. And with all of this experience, I ran for Secretary General in 2006. Close but no cigar, as Groucho Marx would say. Mr. Ban Ki-moon got 2 votes more than me in the first ballot, but by the time of the 4th ballot, it was clear that one of those negative votes was that of a permanent member, in this case, the United States, which had its own policy of what kind of Secretary General they wanted. And so the result was that I stepped aside and left the UN after a nearly 29-year career, 1 month shy of 29 years, on the 1st of April 2007. What did I learn about the UN's strengths and weaknesses? I would say that it was in many ways a mirror of the world. It reflects our great capacities and our great failures. It reflects our strengths and our weaknesses. When 15 countries sit around the Security Council table, and you have one of them as the sole superpower, as the US was for about 20 years, then you can be sure that the other 14 countries are going to be conscious of their relationship with the 15th in any decisions they take or don't take. When 5 have a veto and the others don't, you can be sure that their power and influence can be disproportionate, even to the tune of preventing or ensuring certain discussions without a formal vote of the rest. At the same time, I learned the strength and wisdom of the second Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld's famous observation when the UN was criticized during its first decade, when it had just turned 10 and people said, what a useless organization, it's got so many limits, it couldn't do that, it couldn't do this, it couldn't solve that problem. Hammarskjöld said, listen, the United Nations was not created to take mankind to heaven, but rather to save humanity from hell. In other words, sometimes the best a body like the UN can do is to prevent things from getting worse. And this it did, and it kept adapting to the needs and challenges, the way peacekeeping was invented at a time when there was no peacekeeping in the Charter, and yet it applied effectively well enough to win the Nobel Peace Prize. When the way it changed itself, when I joined the UN in 1978, if I had said to my seniors at that time, listen, I believe I'm joining an organization that is one day going to observe and even run elections in sovereign states, that will conduct intrusive inspections for weapons of mass destruction, that will impose comprehensive sanctions on the entire import-export trade of a member state, that will create a counter-terrorism committee to monitor what its own sovereign government member states are doing in national actions against terrorists, or that it will set up international criminal tribunals and coerce governments into handing over their citizens, even sometimes their former presidents, to be tried by foreigners under international law. If I had said all of that, my seniors would have said, you don't know the UN you're joining, or since those were the 1970s, they would have probably said to me, young man, what have you been smoking? But the truth is, the UN changed from the UN I joined in 1978 to an organization that did all of these things. And therefore, the UN is worth reforming because it's proved it's done enough good work to be worth the effort of reform. And so rather than talking about retiring the UN at 75, we should be talking about renewing the UN and trying to ensure that it is indeed a stronger, better UN. Now, I was afraid we didn't have enough time for everything. I'm going to rush through the rest because we do want to leave time for questions. The three pillars of the UN system includes, of course, the development pillar. The UN has bodies like UNCTAD, the UN Conference for Trade and Development. But today we know as one of the most significant specialized agencies of the UN, the World Trade Organization. It was conceived in the 1940s that because the world had got divided into high tariff zones and protectionism, that World War II had become more possible. So they said, let's try and create an agreement where we will lower tariffs and talk to each other and trade more with each other. Such a body was set up called the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or GATT. And it went on for almost 50 years before it converted itself into a larger organization, the World Trade Organization, a product of the Uruguay round of talks. And the World Trade Organization is now heading for its silver jubilee. Its success has supposed to have been in creating rule of law in international trade and, of course, in promoting free trade by reducing tariff and non-tariff barriers in countries. But at the same time, countries give the same status to other countries that they give to the most favored nations, and to ensure that there's some special and differential treatment for the developing and particularly the least developed countries, which often need protections that the developed countries don't need. They have a number of mechanisms for adjudicating disputes. There is a dispute settlement body called the Trade Policy Review Board, and the bureaucracy within the WTO is fairly representative of the diverse members. But a number of problems have persisted to continue to bedevil the WTO. For example, the USA keeps saying that China takes advantage of its without reciprocating with other countries. It has denied market access to foreign companies or put up non-tariff barriers in China, that it doesn't deserve to be treated as a developing nation. Mind you, the US says India doesn't deserve to be a developing nation either. It accuses China of a lack of trade policy, and it's hostile to the Dispute Settlement Board. Now, what the US has done is, the US has simply refused to allow new members to be appointed when the terms of existing members has expired. And so the result is that whenever the Dispute Settlement Board is supposed to meet, it's supposed to have a quorum of 3 out of the 7 members. Right now, with the retirement of existing members, the body no longer has a quorum, and since 2019 hasn't been meeting. So how do you settle disputes? India and the US have lots of issues. We've just gone back to the WTO a few days ago about the barriers and tariffs placed on our steel and aluminium products. They in turn are angry with us because of the barriers we place on export of agricultural products and on our domestic support to farmers. Plus, we have an export subsidy policy as a developing country that the US challenges today. The question of intellectual property is again something that bedevils the UN system. And the question of whether WTO has really addressed poverty in developing countries remains to be seen, because in many ways, rich countries have remained rich, poor countries are not noticeably less poorer, with the exception of China and India. And it's also true that Europe, for example, has continued to give agricultural subsidies. So much so that it was once observed that the agricultural subsidies in Europe are so high, they would permit every cow in Europe to fly business class around the world. That's the kind of money that the Europeans are spending. How does a poor African farmer without a rich government to give him such subsidies compete once he's exported his products to Europe? Yet multilateral solutions are good for weaker countries because, of course, they leverage the strengths of many countries within them. And right now, the criticism that's being levied is that despite that multilateralism, the WTO hasn't brought enough benefits to the poorer and smaller countries, and that food security is in peril because of the rules of the WTO against the way in which food is not supposed to be given assistance by government. So in India, for example, we have a minimum support price. The government buys agricultural products and stores it, as you know, in stocks for distribution in the ration shops. The US has said that's wrong. India was able to buy itself some time through a peace clause that will continue to permit India to do this until such time as a permanent arrangement is negotiated. So that's called the peace clause, and that continues. But as of now, that is not something the US is particularly happy about, and it continues to divide India from and many of the developing countries from the developed, which is why the Doha round, so-called, has not yet concluded in anything remotely like a successful conclusion. Now, we have reached the time when we should be turning to your questions. If any of the questions are about India and Africa, I'll get to these slides again in answering that. But otherwise, I'll turn to your questions. There's a lot to be said for India and Africa and India and West Asia, but I think we took on too much in the 45 minutes. Let me look at the questions that have been selected by Unacademy. What would be the best way to solve the ongoing crisis between India and Pakistan? How can the relations between the two nations become better? The problem with India-Pakistan relations goes in many ways to the issue of the nature of the Pakistani state. And Navneet, you've asked this question, but it's not just the current ongoing crisis, it's an existential issue. Pakistan, as you know, was founded as a repudiation of the proposition that India lived by, that people of every faith and religion could live side by side in amity and peace. Whereas in Pakistan, as a state founded for people of one faith, their entire logic is that they are not India, and that India itself is a living repudiation of what they stand for. On top of that, the military controlled Pakistan, either having ruled it directly for 32 years of its 75 in existence, or indirectly for the rest of the time, by drawing red lines as to what the civilian governments in Pakistan are able to do. And because the military have that control over that society, they have a vested interest in keeping enough hostility going with both their neighbors, India on the one side and Afghanistan on the other, India in the east, Afghanistan on the west, because that's what justifies the extraordinarily high percentage of GDP that the Pakistani military controls. If there wasn't hostility and tension, the Pakistani army would not be the army with the largest share of the budget of a government, of any government in the world, and the largest share of the GDP of any country in the world. And in those circumstances, hostility becomes a vested interest for the military, and it'll only be when civilians in Pakistan are truly able to assert real power and not depending on the military for survival that true peace is possible. So the best we can hope for in India-Pakistan relations appears to be to promote a modus vivendi where we acknowledge the Pakistani military dominance in their part of the world, but we manage to persuade them not to send terrorists and armed militants across the border to our country, doing us damage, and simply allows us to be left alone to grow in peace. That kind of amicable relationship, plus some cooperation in SAARC and so on, is what we want to see happening. Pakistan, however, for the longest time took the position that until Kashmir was given to them on the grounds that it was a Muslim majority state in British India, in the days of the British Raj, it was never part of British India, it was a princely state. But on the grounds of its Muslim majority, Pakistan said, you give us Kashmir and then we can talk about normal relations, but they can't be normal relations while Kashmir is not solved. And as a result, the Pakistani army has felt free to keep sending, financing, arming, training, equipping terrorists and militants to come across and wreak havoc in India, which the most notorious example was 26/11/2008 in Mumbai. But as you know, there were many, many other incidents, much smaller, but equally deadly, killing people in various parts of our country. So the real issue is relations can become better when Pakistan decides that it's not in their interest to continue doing this. What will it take for Pakistan to decide that? Either a very enlightened military ruler or the complete eclipse of the military and a very strong civilian ruler, neither of which seem to be very much on the cards now. But I would argue that what India can do, we can't just sit back and wait for the Pakistanis to change, because we have a vested interest in peace in our own country. We know that we need investment and that investors will not come and invest in a war zone. Therefore, we actually need, obviously, the kind of resources that permit us to make a big difference for our own people. And for that, we need investors coming in. We need peace on our borders. So what could we do to encourage Pakistan to think that way? The policy that I have long advocated, including in my book, Pax Indica, and the policy adopted by the Parliamentary Standing Committee on External Affairs in its report to Parliament a couple of years ago, was to open up the people-to-people space in Pakistan with the Pakistanis, create thereby a larger constituency for peace with India in Pakistan. Pakistanis who come here on visas, visit, and so on, always go away feeling enamored of India, and they become, as it were, a constituency for normal relations, whether they're business people, journalists, or just people with relatives here, or people just coming over to shop. They would really enjoy having the freedom and the facility to do that. I want to remind you that when Muhammad Ali Jinnah created Pakistan, he expressed the hope that India and Pakistan would have intimate relations like the US and Canada, with free and soft borders and easy connections and cooperation between the two. That is far from the reality today, but that's the objective one day we can get to if our people have the opportunity to show the friendship here that they show usually abroad. Whenever Indians and Pakistanis meet and live side by side, work in international bodies and so on, they're the best of friends. That would be one way we can take actions to help the relations to become better. Will COVID-19 change the world order? Very big question, and would take an hour-long talk in itself. My short answer is there is some real concern about two things that I wrote about in my last book, The New World Disorder. One is the decreasing legitimacy of international institutions. The World Health Organization has suffered a lot of criticism in the wake of COVID. President Trump has attacked it directly, saying that it towed the Chinese line, it spewed Chinese propaganda, that it actually kept from the world the reality of the COVID crisis, and that it's too beholden to a big power like China. And that's broadly true of many of the international institutions. They're very much beholden to powers like China and the US, ironically, and therefore the autonomy and independence that the heads of these organizations should have is often illusory. And that is something that we'll have to address. The legitimacy of the institutions. I would recommend a single non-renewable term for a Secretary General of the UN or a Director General of WHO, so they don't come under pressure to go ahead and do the kind of things that the WHO is accused of doing or failing to do during the COVID crisis. And the second issue, which was already brewing before COVID, was the reassertion of national sovereignties, particularly with the rise of ethno-nationalist populisms in many, many countries in the world. We have Mr. Trump, Mr. Putin, we have President Xi in China, Mr. Erdogan in Turkey, we have Brexit in Britain with the British becoming more nationalist, Mr. Modi in India. All of this means that with more nationalisms rising, countries are going to want to reduce their dependence on external sources of supply. The breaking of the supply chains because of COVID has shaken a number of countries. Japan is actually giving a significant number of financial incentives, $200 billion, to the Japanese companies that are willing to relocate out of China and come back to Japan, and a smaller amount to those who are willing to relocate to third countries like ours. But the idea is reducing dependence on powers which could obviously make these countries very vulnerable. What will be India's role? I hope that India's role will be constructively directed towards strengthening global cooperation. I believe that is where our interest lies, and I argue this both in my book, my co-authored book, The New World Disorder with Samir Saran, and also in a couple of op-eds that he and I have written since COVID. But I would say that there's every indication that India too might learn the lessons of becoming more protective, creating more self-reliance, supporting more of its own industries here. And so the world will certainly be, in my view, a less globalized, less intimately mutually dependent world than we were before COVID. What are my views on the supranational organizations? as a hierarchy above national governments. No, they're not above national governments. That's a misunderstanding. All these bodies are actually governments getting together. They're like a club. If you go off and join a cricket club, the cricket club is not above you. The cricket club is all of you. If tomorrow all of you pull out, the cricket club collapses. If tomorrow the most influential member or the best batsman or the best bowler says, I don't want to be in this club anymore, the club suffers. So it's not something above. It can't order you to do something you don't want to do. And that's true of all of these international organizations. We are not, when we talk about a phrase global governance, we're not talking about a global government. We're nowhere near there. Nor are we talking about regional governments of these various organizations. What we are really talking about is sovereign governments or getting together as in a club to get something done that suits them. And they will do it as long as they believe it suits them. And as long as they don't want to do it, it won't be done. Mind you, I'm a big fan of India's involvement in many of these groupings, not because they're above us, but because we can leverage them for our own benefit. You know, it's interesting. Every year, our foreign minister meets in something called the RIC, the foreign ministers of Russia, India, China. Then he adds now the Brazilians and the South Africans in a meeting of BRICS. Then he takes away the Chinese and the Russians, and he meets with the Brazilians and South Africans in IPSA for South-South cooperation. And to that group, he adds the Chinese, but not the Russians, and creates BASIC for environmental negotiations. And, you know, India is the only country that's a member of all of these groups, not merely because our name conveniently begins with that indispensable element in every acronym of vowel, but because we are required in these groupings for them to have strength and meaning, and we in turn feel we derive international negotiating benefit from them. Next question, amidst the declining US hegemony, what are your views on China becoming the new global hegemon? There is a real worry. The Chinese are using economic heft in an unprecedented way. They're buying up assets around the world. We all know the case of the Hambantota port in Sri Lanka, when they lent so much money to the Sri Lankans that the Sri Lankans could not afford to service the debt, and instead literally gave them control for the next 99 years of a port on sovereign Sri Lankan soil in lieu of having to pay that debt. The same thing could happen one day to Pakistan because of the $63 billion of debt that Pakistan has incurred in the construction of that corridor linking the port of Gwadar to the Western Chinese landmass. We've had a very interesting report recently that in many countries in the Western world, because the values of companies have started collapsing as a result of market shocks in the wake of COVID, that China is moving in and buying up a significant percentage of these companies. These are all ways of exercising a new hegemony, and I believe the world should be wary. I don't think that a country like India has any interest in either seeing a unipolar world with Chinese hegemony, nor a new G2 condominium of the US or China jointly running the world, nor a new Cold War between the US and China where we'll have to choose sides. We need to be able to maneuver between them. We need to keep them both hemmed in a global system in which countries like India are also at the high table. I've often joked to be at the table because in global geopolitics, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And too many people have been eating us for their lunch for a long time. It's time that we went from being a rule taker in the international system to a rule maker. And the only way we can do that is to ensure the world isn't carved up between two superpowers, let alone under the control of one, and that we can work together with them in order to ensure that we will actually have a say, and that our own capacities and strengths and everything from cyberspace to outer space will also get an opportunity to help create the rules of the road for the world. To do that and to help other countries also have an equal weight, we need to prevent hegemony of any kind. How can the rise of Taliban affect India? Very, very seriously. The last time the Taliban were in power in Afghanistan, we had the Kandahar hijacking. We had terrorism being spawned in Kashmir, with Afghans coming across with Taliban encouragement. We had serious security challenges. And that's one of the reasons we have been very skeptical about the American peace talks with the Taliban. If the Taliban come back to power in Afghanistan, India will have to be very, very much on alert. That's it. I'm sorry we've hit 5 o'clock, but I do want to apologize for the beginning confusion on the slides. We'll be okay for tomorrow. Those of you who want to get together with me tomorrow, for a second lecture are welcome. Meanwhile, thank you for joining me. I'm sorry that's all we could get to in the 1 hour available, but all the very best. Jai Hind.